One.
Hi, I'm Heather McLean from the Alliance Against Northern Pass, and today we have a special report, and we're coming from the Conservation Law Foundation in Concord, and I'm going to be talking to Christophe Courchesne, who is a staff attorney for the Conservation Law Foundation, and we are going to be talking about the Northern Pass transmission line and what has occurred between the last year, right, in the permitting process. And so for those of you who are not aware of what the Conservation Law Foundation is, Christophe is going to give us a brief explanation as to what he does and why that's important.
Sure, Heather, thanks. The Conservation Law Foundation is a regional environmental organization. We have offices in 5 of the New England states, and our mission is about protecting the environment of New England for the benefit of all people. And we've been involved in this Northern Pass transmission project since it was announced 2 years ago this week. And we've been involved primarily through the lens of looking at 2 things. We've been looking at the permitting process and ensuring that's fair, and ensuring that it considers all the impacts of the project and ultimately comes to a fair decision. The other angle we've been looking at this is the energy side. The fact that we are one of the only organizations in New England looking at energy issues from a public interest standpoint, looking at what's right for the region from an environmental perspective, from an economic perspective. And so this project is being pitched as a regional project, and it was really incumbent upon us to try to understand it, try to understand what the pros and cons were, and that's what we have been doing for the last 2 years. Carefully evaluating the things that have been said about it, and trying to reach our own conclusions.
Okay, well, this is important because the public sees only what is advertised, for example, that it's a renewable project, that it's green energy, which is not true. Not true, especially with the big hydro. Would you agree with me on that?
So there are real issues with the source of the power coming out of Quebec. One of the big claims about the source of power is that it's essentially carbon free.
Right.
And that's been the huge selling point that they continue to press at every juncture, including as recently as last week in their call with investor analysts about the project. They were talking about how it will reduce the carbon emissions of the region by 5 million tons. One thing we did over the last year was look at is that number solid? Where is the number coming from? And if you dig down into the numbers, it's actually based on an assumption that reservoirs and big dams have no carbon emissions. So we know that based on the research that we've analyzed, and we actually put out a report in February about this. That's not true. The research shows that when you dam a big area on a net basis, you have a lot more emissions coming out of the landscape than you did before. In fact, in the early years after you dam a reservoir, it's like a natural gas plant. Guess what power that the power is supposed to displace in New England? Natural gas.
Right.
So you're talking about no benefit in the short term from bringing in this power in terms of carbon benefits. So that's 0 instead of 5 million tons.
Okay.
So that's an example of one of these energy-related issues that we've looked at with respect to this project.
Okay. Well, we're going to move on to what's going on right now. I'd love to go back to that question. What did you recently find out about the permitting process between the Department of Energy and the Northern Pass transmission?
So I think that it may be good to take a quick step back and then try to understand what the permitting process is supposed to accomplish and what it's about. Northern Pass needs a permit to cross the border into the United States from Canada. It's called a presidential permit, and that permit process is administered by the Department of Energy, very large federal agency in Washington. There are other agencies involved in that process, including the Forest Service, which has its own approval that Northern Pass needs, and the Army Corps of Engineers, which needs to approve certain of the wetlands permits that they need, and the Environmental Protection Agency has also decided to become a part of the process. So there's a number of different agencies involved, but the Department of Energy is leading this permitting process. It was 2 years ago that Northern Pass filed its application for the presidential permit. What happens when they do that type of filing, under federal law, the federal government needs to take a hard look, it's called a hard look, at the environmental impacts of the project and all reasonable alternatives to the project. It's a requirement of a law called the National Environmental Policy Act, which is a 40-year-old law. And it applies to all major federal actions, such as granting a permit, or if you're building a new highway, or if you're doing anything significant. The federal government, if they have to approve it or have a role in it, need to analyze those issues. That's where we get a lot of the data and the information about what this project is about, is by the federal agencies looking at what the private party, in this case Northern Pass, is proposing and what the real story about it is. And that it's not just an environmental study. It actually covers things like socioeconomic impacts. It covers impacts on energy resources. And so it's supposed to be a comprehensive look at this project. And it's not just about the border crossing. It's about the entirety of the proposal. So there was a permit application filed in October of 2010. What we found out is that before that even happened, Northern Pass, the entity, Northern Pass Transmission LLC, which is the permit applicant here, which is going for the permit, it's the subsidiary of Northeast Utilities, the big mega utility in New England right now. And Northern Pass Transmission LLC was integrally involved in the permitting process behind the scenes, working very closely with the Department of Energy from really day one. So we found this out.
Okay.
We found this out through what's called a Freedom of Information Act request, which we filed last year, about a year ago. It took a year for DOE to get back to us.
That's a long time.
They actually, the law requires them to respond within 10 days and say whether they have any documents and what their plan is for providing the documents. And they did do the statutory quick cover letter and said, we'll get back to you. So it took a year.
Okay.
We received about 1,500 pages worth of documents. Those documents really chronicle the process that's been happening at the Department of Energy. And what they show is that Northern Pass Transmission LLC entity and its attorney have been shaping and controlling the process basically at DOE's request throughout, which doesn't really make any sense when you think about what this federal environmental review and permitting process is supposed to accomplish, that fair and objective review of this private proposal.
Okay.
So there's a couple of important details about what we found, which is what we raised in our filing yesterday. We found that Northern Pass made the same mistake again that they made at the very beginning of the process. And some folks may recall that at the very beginning of the process, DOE announced that they would be using Normando Associates.
Yep.
Normando is a well-known New Hampshire consulting firm, but Normando was also working for Northern Pass on its state permits. So it was working as an advocate for Northern Pass.
Right.
And what we've learned is that Northern Pass went out, was tasked with figuring out who the contractor should be to prepare the EIS by DOE.
Right.
And that was the original mistake. Northern Pass came up with a great plan to use its own contractor, erected some supposed barriers within Normando to try to isolate the two teams that were working on the state permits and the federal permit. But ultimately that arrangement violated the regulations. It posed a clear conflict of interest. Because if you're Norman Doe, you will get more work on the state side if the federal permit goes through.
Right.
So
Okay.
you have a strong incentive
Yeah.
to reach conclusions at all levels favorable
Okay.
to the proponent of the project.
Now, a conflict of interest is not illegal, or is it?
So the way that it works is that these environmental regulations that govern the environmental review process, they establish that there are really two requirements for these types of environmental reviews. DOE can go outside DOE and pick a contractor to help it. It's a large job. There's a lot of data collection involved, data collection and analysis. So the regulations allow them to go out and get a third-party contractor.
Okay.
And that contractor is paid by the developer, so that the taxpayer does not pay for that when an application comes in. That makes sense. The two requirements are that that third-party contractor needs to be chosen solely by the Department of Energy, and that contractor be chosen so that that contractor has no conflict of interest.
Correct.
So those are the two requirements.
Okay.
And what we found is that, actually in the first instance with Norman Doe, DOE violated both requirements.
Okay.
So at that time, Northern Pass actually wasn't DOE. Northern Pass came in and said this issue, which people have raised, that Norman Doe's working for two masters, is significant enough that what we need to do to ensure public confidence in the permitting process is take Norman Doe out of the picture and choose another contractor.
Mm-hmm.
That appeared to be a good result for everyone involved, because at least we thought there would be an independent contractor that would be working on this permitting process. We were discouraged by a number of the decisions DOE had made throughout this initial phase, which I won't bore you with the details of, but the point is that, we thought things might be better with the new contractor. And it took about 4 months. They announced a new contractor team and essentially said to the public, DOE chose this new contractor team. They have no conflict of interest. They haven't done any work for Northeast Utilities or for Northern Pass or for Hydro-Quebec for that matter.
Mm-hmm.
So this is the team that's going to move this process forward and going to safeguard the public's interest in a fair process. Unfortunately, while that may have been the public message from DOE, we've learned is that, they violated those same two requirements again.
Why doesn't that surprise anybody?
They let Northern Pass basically go out and recruit the new contractor team in a very direct and personal way. They essentially outsourced that job to Northern Pass, and almost as a result of that, the new contractor has a conflict of interest, which the contractor team has been selected by Northern Pass. Northern Pass brought the contractor team into DOE, had them do a dog and pony show for DOE, helped them prepare their written materials so that they could get the job. And then DOE said very shortly thereafter, these folks have the job. If you imagine yourself in that position of having just gotten all this help from someone to get a job, how can anyone have confidence going forward that the decisions that they make in terms of how that environmental study is done, what is studied, what alternatives are studied, all those types of decisions which the contractor will be involved in, how can you have confidence that that contractor is not saying to itself, well, I got hired by these guys.
Right.
I owe hundreds of thousands of dollars in consulting fees to this firm. So why can the public have confidence that that contractor will be reaching fair determinations on the project that are truly objective? And so they violated both requirements that they were supposed to abide by. DOE did.
Okay.
And we have a huge problem. And what we did yesterday was actually Tuesday night that we filed a long 13-page letter with DOE stating our objections, attaching all the documents that demonstrate that this occurred, and insisting that the contractor team be removed.
Okay. Which would start the whole process all over again.
Essentially, yes. They would need to replace the contractor with somebody new, and do so, our request is, without any influence from Northern Pass. Last time, they when they went back to the drawing board, they just gave the assignment to Northern Pass. Come up with someone to help us out. And so they did. What we're saying is this time, DOE has to do it. Or, DOE could do this internally. They have various arms of DOE, including the national labs, that do write environmental impact statements and have that capability. They could also go out to the private market, have a competitive process, ensure that none of the people who are, none of the firms that are competing for the business have a conflict with Northeast Utilities in the sense that they've done lots of business for them or something of that nature. And they could remedy the process in that manner. That's the first request. There's a number of other requests in the letter, which basically are asking DOE to reinstitute fairness. Have additional time for the scoping process, which is that large process that happened last year that everyone remembers, where all the public hearings occurred. Their current plan appears to be to have one scoping meeting after the new route is announced, and 45 days for people to weigh in on that. And one thing we asked for was, let's have more meetings up and down the state. It's been a long time. People have moved into the area. I mean, there's a different group of people who may be concerned about it. Certainly there'll be a different group in the northern 40 miles, depending on what Northern Pass proposes. But right. Up and down the state, there's been a lot of water under the bridge, and we think it's only fair to the public that they have additional opportunities to participate in the process. And that ultimately DOE doesn't just politely listen to the public comments and then ignore them.
Well, that seems to be that's the general consensus.
And that's unfortunately the frustration we've had as well. You know, we've asked for some very reasonable things in this permitting process. One of the first things we asked for was, come out and tell us what your plan is for the environmental review. Do that publicly before you go off and draft a 1,000-page document. Put that out there for public comment. Announce what you're going to do, and specifically announce what alternatives are on the table. Because the alternatives that are on the table right now from DOE's perspective appear to be just draw a different little line on the map.
Okay.
Come up with a different route. That's what they have been moving towards in terms of what alternatives will be considered in the environmental impact study.
Okay.
And as we all know, it's been, a key part of the whole debate that there are alternatives to building large overhead lines.
Especially now, with all of the technology, the underground burial.
So there are alternatives, technological, there are routing alternatives, there's there's HV, these high voltage direct current lines that are already in the ground. There's one that goes right through New Hampshire right now. Why don't we talk about
well, we know why they don't want to talk about it.
Co-locating there. Now, the beautiful thing, and it's really an important protection for the public, is that the environmental impact statement is not concerned, is not really overly concerned with the idea that we can't tell the applicant to go build somewhere they don't own.
Right.
And that's a really critical piece, because I believe the state agencies that will do the citing of this on a state level are on the record saying, well, we can't tell somebody to go off and do something where they don't own it. Well, the federal government can, in this study, say, you know what, it's substantially preferable to do this somewhere else or in a different manner. applicant, you can go figure that out and do that. But if you can't, we're going to determine that the proposal that you have on the table, the alternative that you've proposed, is not preferable. And as a result of that, it's not consistent with the public interest to grant the permit to you. If you can come back and come up with a better plan, or you adopt one of the other alternatives we've looked at that are consistent, with the public interest, then you can come in and proceed with your project. But if you want to keep doing what you're planning on doing, that's where the federal government can say no.
What are the chances of that, though?
Well, I'm not. I guess I can't really speak to the outcome here. What we're trying desperately to do, and really we tried to do with Normando, and we're trying to do here, is that it's vastly preferable for the federal government to do its job, consistent with the law, consistent with fairness and objectivity, the first time. Because if you have a tainted process that the public lacks confidence in, and that violates the regulations, that's not a legally defensible permitting process. And it can go through, years of people's time. And at the end of the day, it is not a defensible decision.
So this conflict of interest could result in a denial for the presidential permit?
To the extent that, I think this is a good question, what this conflict of interest means.
Yes.
For people to really understand.
What can you really do?
So what we've asked for is for that contractor team to be replaced with someone without a conflict of interest.
Right.
That the public could have confidence that that contractor would do a fair job with its part of the work. And that whatever DOE's ultimate decision would be, will have to be based on all that information. If we get rid of the conflict of interest now, we can have a legitimate, fair review of Northern Pass by the federal government. There's a number of pieces, as I mentioned, of the Forest Service is going to be looking at this and relying on the environmental impact statement.
Right.
As many of your viewers may know, the Forest Service has a different process and a different standard that
Correct.
This project will have to meet to cross through the national forest. It's really important that the documents that they use, all the analysis that they use to reach that ultimate decision on whether the crossing the forest makes sense, it's important that that be done with integrity and fairness. So the conflict of interest, if they continue without change their process now, what it means to us is that DOE has really turned its back on a fair process. And while we will continue to advocate strenuously through that proceeding all the way through to the end, trying to continue to push for a better process, it will have certain, what we believe are fatal flaws that mean that at the end of the day, this project should not go forward. So that's how I would describe it.
Okay.
It's a really critical issue to get this right the first time.
Another question I would have too is there's been some thought that the original EIS from Normando might be utilized in some sense by the next contractor. Any information is that?
So one of the interesting things that we found was that it doesn't appear Normando did a lot of substantive analysis, although they may have done some data collection.
Mm-hmm.
It's really important to us that be very clear. Which contractor did which work.
Right.
If it's a matter of there being some kind of very cut and dry data that Normando collected that then could be analyzed and independently checked by the new contractor team or by DOE, that might be okay. But when you have contractor team or Normando doing substantive work and making judgments, that's more of a problem. So one of the points we identify in this filing, documents show that after Norman Doe was withdrawn in April of last year, they were still sorting through scoping comments and categorizing them. Now what that means is that, you know, that process could mean that people's public comments, you know, are being improperly categorized or categorized with a by methods or into categories that don't reflect that objective review we're trying to promote.
Okay.
So that was disturbing to us, that we found out that type of work was still going on by Norman Doe a month after they had been formally withdrawn.
Right.
That's again another reason why, you know, this tale is so troubling. Is that that type of thing happening just shows a disregard for those public concerns that led to Norman Doe being withdrawn in the first place. So we have this, you know, ongoing issue where we don't know right now how much work the contractor team has done on this, how much analysis they've done, what decisions are reflected in their work already. We have some disturbing suggestions in some of the documents we saw, such as that there won't be a solid alternatives analysis, but we don't know for sure.
Mm-hmm.
And our view is that you need to use a contractor that has no conflict of interest, that was selected through the correct process. So there may be some information or analysis that needs to be redone by someone independent. There may be some stuff that can be used that was done previously by these prior contractors.
But do you trust them to do that?
And that's really the key question, you know, those decisions, substantive decisions on the direction of the environmental impact statement, what it's going to address, all those types of issues need to be decided objectively and fairly so that the public has confidence in them. So that's really a really key request that we've made, which is, you know, Norman Doe did that work on the scoping process. We think that work should be redone. I think it's a fair request. It wasn't, based on what we saw, it was not a tremendous amount of work, but you know, I don't think that when people submitted their comments in March and April of last year, they expected that the contractor had been withdrawn because of a conflict of interest would be sorting them and allocating them into different categories and, you know, kind of exercising judgment about what they mean.
Mm-hmm.
That should be done by the independent contractor without a conflict of interest, or by DOE itself.
Okay.
So,
Well, that kind of puts it all together, and I guess the next step would be what the public could do to assist that. And isn't there a way we could go in and make scoping comments specifically about this?
yes, absolutely. There's the scoping period that DOE started is still open because Northern Pass hasn't provided its routing information, so it's still in this indefinite open period. People can go in and submit scoping comments through our website if they're concerned about this specific issue, and the way to do that is to go to clf.org.
Okay.
For the next week or so, we'll have on the front page, there's a rotating image, and one of the images will, if you click on it, will get you right to one of the posts that I've done about this, with a direct link to a page that lets you submit a comment just about this issue with a few clicks. We've done the hard work for you.
Making it easy.
We're trying to give people the opportunity to weigh in, and if you feel like you want to submit a slightly different comment, or you have a different view than the comment that we've put together for you, you can go to northernpasseis.us, and it should be fairly easy for you to find the place where you can actually add your own comment through their website directly, and that will go into the public record as well. And it's really important that if this is an issue of concern to you, that if you think that the fairness of this process is something that New Hampshire actually deserves, that they don't deserve a tilted, biased, tainted process, then it's really incumbent upon us to let DOE know that, because I have a lot of respect for the Secretary of Energy, Secretary Chu. He's a very, very accomplished individual, Nobel Prize winner, and his priorities in terms of public participation and doing the right thing that he's expressed before should have some weight. And these types of interactions and issues that I'm discussing are happening at a level below his office.
Okay.
And so there's an opportunity to make a difference, to essentially hold DOE accountable, hold its internal staff accountable for doing this the right way.
So people make a difference. Our opinions, our thoughts, and our views do influence the process at some point.
And I think the best example of that so far has been the Normandeau situation. DOE's response to that was not, we find out later, it was not correct and was not commensurate with what people were concerned about. But it's clear that that actually did make a difference at that point, and we need to make that same difference again, even more strong. We need to make the point even more strongly that this is about fairness for New Hampshire. It's about fairness for the potentially impacted residents. It's about the kind of process that analyzes this project the way that it needs to be analyzed.
That's right. That's right. So for those of you who sort of don't really think you have an impact, we're here to say you do, and there's two different ways that you can let your voice be heard. So you can go to clf.org, okay, and go to Christophe's blog, right? Or click on one of the...
Yeah, you can click on the image on the front page. There will be a...
That's easy enough.
Be a direct link in there. And I would also encourage folks to reach out to your elected representatives in Washington on this issue. They've had influence before. I think they can have influence again.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much for bringing us this news today, and we will hope that you'll continue to be our watchdog over the Northern Pass project.
Thank you, Heather.
Thanks.
Pleasure speaking with you.
Nice to meet you and spend some time with you today.
Thank you.